coming out today. You're welcome to come up.
Well, I might have to leave early.
Oh, okay. Gosh, I just appreciate anybody getting in their car and in the house.
We just went and had our free tour at the governor's mansion. That was cool. Yeah, we're not making a day of it.
Well, shall we get to going? Shall we do that? There's Becca. Oh, wait a minute. Uh-oh. Becca knows everything.
Ciao, Becca.
She's back. I'm selfishly and very self-centeredly using the crowd. I just got this book. Does this logo mean anything to you? It means, oh, wait, there you go. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Does it mean anything? Have you ever seen that logo? No. See how that's been okay. So it's an Aladdin's lamp. Well, it's I found this morning at a thrift store.
Can you hear? Boy, I bet you can. Did you, any? Oh, okay. Well, that is kind of what I like to do, is find things, so I will. Oh. Do we?
Well, thanks for
There's
coming.
protocol.
This is like the best crowd ever because we got you here.
Exactly right.
Second Saturdays are free every month, and thank you for coming. I'm Sue Neer, Development Officer. And before I introduce our speaker, I just want to let you know that we're having we have a special offer today for a $100 donation to the Montana Heritage Center. We're offering in exchange either a print by John Alberg of Stan Line or a print by Bob Morgan of the Newsboys statue.
Oh.
And those are limited edition prints. So both Bill and Becky Eicher and John Alberg are great supporters and have given us these to give to you. So if you're interested in that, see me later or even after today. So today is going to be special because we have Zoe Stoltz, our reference historian, who will be talking about recipes and cookbooks and eating in Montana.
Eating in Montana.
Which is her special area of expertise.
It is. Because I've done it for 61 years.
There you go. Thank you, Zoe.
No, thank you. Oh, thank you. First, thank you for coming out today. When I left the house, I told myself, if you have 5 people, you're going to be happy. And I think we've doubled that. Yes. So I'm really, really happy. Thanks for coming out today. So when Sue first approached me, of course, I just hit the cookbooks. But the cookbooks did not really convey holiday to me. And so credit for today's talk goes to Dave Walter, one of our historians. He at one time was the reference historian, and then he wound up being one of the primary interpreters for the Historical Society. They are expecting more copies of this in the bookstore on Monday, I believe. But what Dave did for this, and I will tell you that never does a day go by that I don't see Dave's handwriting on something that I pull. And I've gotten to know his research techniques, and he's got some great tricks. But and I will share some of them as I talk about this. But he takes primary documents like John Owen's journals, something narrated by Granville Stewart, and then he does stretch it and start using newspaper reports to talk about Montana, Montanans, and how they've celebrated, I'm going to say, the winter, not just the holidays. And I went through and started finding how many times the authors were mentioning food. Well, food and community, food and community, food and community. Because John Owen is talking about when they're lucky enough to have eggs and make eggnog in 1857, but he's talking about who's taking the trip to spend Christmas with them. or the man who fired the howitzer. I'm not sure that's what he called it, but they evidently had a cannon at Fort Owen and fired it just for fun and to make noise. And so at some levels, nothing's changed and how we want to celebrate. So this evolved definitely into a collection of winter stories and how Montanans have survived the winter and celebrated community as well as food. So the first thing, this is my favorite Russell Christmas drawing. I don't know if the original still exists, but it was used as, I've given it credit, on a magazine that was coming out of, I think, Helena. Becca, was it coming out of Helena? It was titled Helena, Treasure State, 1909. And I just love it. It's called The Kid Road Agent, and then you have to question the wisdom of the kid. Don't you? All right. So, nothing in Montana as far as stories cannot start with Native Americans. And of course, they weren't worried about Christmas or the holidays, but certainly each tribe has its own winter traditions and its foods. And so I pulled out a couple of my favorite sources, and there are 2, 3 really wonderful sources on Crow foods and the rhythm of foods. One is a thesis that came out of Carroll College in 1970. So if you're ever interested in that, come on up and we'll be happy to pull that for you. So as I read through these, what struck me was the pemmican, as always mentioned, and we've all heard of that, the fry bread, and the prairie turnip. Now, I was not familiar with the prairie turnip, and as it turns out, the Crow called it breadroot. And it was used in every shape and form. It was often tied together like we do garlic. It was pulverized and added to boiling soups. You name it, and the wild turnip, was added to it. Beware, do not go around looking for the wild turnip because it looks a lot like lupin. So, that is something that would be fun to learn, wouldn't it? To discern the lupin from the prairie turnip. But then let's jump to the other side of the mountains, or the other side of the state. And the Blackfeet, of course, a lot of the stories then around the Blackfeet, and we have 3 Blackfeet cookbooks, starting, I want to say, in the mid-1960s, and a couple of them are very traditional community cookbooks, but one really does focus on those traditional foods and stories. And over again, the choke cherries were mentioned in regards to pemmican, the boiled meats, and the camas. So the camas is a starchy root. The boiled meats are interesting because, of course, that is a very traditional way of any Native American to prepare the meats. They did not have cast iron skillets, so they boiled meats. But let's get back to the pemmican. So on both, in the Crow literature as well as the Blackfeet, they talked about the importance and the value of pemmican. And this just fascinated me. And especially let me remember here, I want to say the Crow, the pemmican played an important role in what they called Thanksgiving ceremonies. And these weren't traditionally or necessarily winter ceremonies, but pemmican, let's say someone has had a very good year, or someone had some very important prayers answered. So they would hold a Thanksgiving ceremony, and they could invite anywhere from 2 or 3 people to dozens of people. And always they had to have a certain amount of pemmican for each person who attended. And pemmican was also, depending I'm sure on just how terrible the winter was, so valuable that the Native Americans actually trade horses for the pemmican.
So what exactly
Is the pemmican? I'm so glad you asked. So first, it's so time-consuming, as so many of the early foods are. But it's so self-sufficient. And of course, that was one of the ingenious things about Native Americans. They didn't have to worry about taking their wheat to the grist mill. Their foods were right there. And a small family could gather foods to last the winter, as opposed to, let's say, the Europeans, who they might be growing wheat, but then they've got to grind it. It takes a community, more of a community. So, pemmican. And I know you can make pemmican out of different berries and fruits, but time and time again in the readings that I did, and please remember that was limited, they mentioned chokecherries. So, first you get meat. And of course, the better the cut, the nicer it's going to be to process and easier. And you boil and dry or grill and dry the meat. Time and time again, they talk about has to be dried. It has to be dried. And then it is pulverized. It's pulverized. Say again?
How did they boil it if they didn't have pots?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not going to be able to
Unless they have it under a rock or
explain this very well. But they would take a stomach, clean it out, and there were certain techniques about how you place the rocks and whatnot. And quite honestly, we have archaeologists around, so I don't worry about the details. I always just call them. But then boiling, hot rocks would be put in the container with the meat and the vegetables and the water.
I see, okay.
Mm-hmm. And another, what are those bags that they sell now to put roasting bags? So another description that I found for roasting meat was to get part of an intestine and put meat in it and then very carefully roast it over a fire because you didn't want it to break, otherwise you'd lose all those wonderful juices.
Right.
Good question. Thank you.
Whose stomach and whose intestines? Like buffalo.
Traditionally, we're talking buffalo.
Deer.
In my reading, there was a lot of mention to buffalo and bighorn sheep for some reason. And again, it might be just the circumstances of the author and their experiences. But again, good questions. So, right, where was I? Oh, pemmican. So the meat dried and then pulverized. And then the berries are pulverized. And it was all the readings I did, no matter what tribe, were very specific about you want the seeds in those berries. And so imagine probably the nutrition that's coming with those seeds. And you pulverize and pulverize and pulverize. And then you take a certain amount of fat. And please do not say to anybody that Zoan is an expert on that, because I'm not. I'm just regurgitating. And you make patties, but something that will dry. And of course, the drying is painstaking because if it doesn't dry, then it won't last. It'll spoil. And the readings talk about how sweet that pemmican is. So between the fat, whether it's going to be bear grease, or I'm trying to think of any wild meat that I've had that had, usually by the time my ex got the meat, it was way late in the season and they were so raunchy. They didn't have a whole lot of fat. But I think of bear grease for some reason. And maybe the elk, maybe bighorn sheep have lots of fat on. But treasured. And think of the nutrition, the protein and the vitamins packed into those little cakes. So the Thanksgiving ceremony and pemmican, I thought that was a wonderful story. But food and community. Okay, then we're going to move on. One of the first entries in Dave's book talked about Ross Cox, who starts this narrative anyway. He wrote a journal and reminiscences, but he starts at Spokane House, which obviously is going to be in the area of Spokane, and was originally working for Astoria. Astor, is that, what group was that? What fur trade group was that? Say again? Well, he then goes to the Northwest Fur Trading Company. But he is reassigned to the Salish House, which was on the Flathead River and one of the tributaries. But he gives an excruciating description of making his way from the Spokane area to the Flathead. And then when they hit the Flathead, the trading post is being managed by Mr. McMillan, on the 24th of December, everybody is delighted to see them because not only do they bring ammunition and lots of rum, but a bag of flour, a bag of rice, plenty of tea and coffee, some arrowroot, and 15 gallons of prime rum. Now, my first thought was, oh my gosh, how much does 15 gallons weigh? So, they did have pack horses with them. Thank heaven. But he talks about the camaraderie and how excited everybody is to see new faces. And they have a really, really great Christmas. They are with the Salish, and he also talks about the Salish. The Salish, he right away winds up trading because he's also brought tobacco. And there hasn't been any European tobacco in that area for quite some time. All right. Be sure if you just came in, if you have questions, just let me know.
C.M. Russell you were talking about? Or
No. This is Charlie Russell's Free Trader. I just like it. And I was talking about 1813 fur traders. Okay? Mm-hmm. Oh, wrong place. Okay, Fort Owen. For those of you who may not be aware, St. Mary's was the first mission settlement in what was to become Montana. Father de Smet and several of his colleagues were brought here, enticed by the Salish peoples. About 1850, early 1850s, the Jesuits have decided that they need to move to a location that will better serve the Salish peoples than St. Mary's. So John Owen buys the location and puts up a fort. And this is it. It's rather amazing. One of the things he was particularly proud of is the grist mill. Remember I mentioned Europeans needing so much support to get their foods going and to make them palatable. Well, he had a grist mill eventually, and he was very, very proud of it. And now this is where I've got to. And John Owen's journals are in our archives downstairs. It is, where Stevensville. Very close to Stevensville. And this is not the original church, but it certainly is older. And if I had gotten, I like this because of the Creche course and the mountains. But it's logs on the side, hand-hewn logs. So, no, so it's going to be down around Stevensville. What mountains? Anybody? Bitterroots? Okay. So, his journals. 1854, we had quite a merry time. Mince pies and cakes that would have done credit to a table in a more civilized part of the world. 1855, we had a pleasant Christmas with some of the good things of this world, sufficient brandy for punches and mince pies, which were got up in a very good style. At least we all thought so. Yes, they were. 1857, nice eggnog in the morning as for dinner. Few in a more civilized world can boast of a better one. 1862, butchered a young steer I had purchased from Chief Victor. Mr. Harris also butchered a fine mutton. Mrs. Harris gave me a dozen eggs. Now, I want you to stop and think, how amazing it's going to be to have hens that are laying in December in Montana. They weren't just putting on a light, were they? Okay. So, eggs for tomorrow. And we will toast her with well-filled goblets. And that's, we had salutes to small arms and eggnog. And this is where the howitzer comes in. Mr. Harris last night gave us a salute from the 4-pound brass howitzer. And then Mr. Banty and lady, Mr. Peters and lady called and took dinner with us, Harris and secretary. Christmas, 1864, we had eggnog this morning. And 65 bourbon syrup. And Mr. Harris fires off the howitzer again. 1865, they also had oysters.
Oh, in Montana.
In Montana. Oysters were everywhere. Sometimes they were good and sometimes they weren't. And we'll get into that. Ah, right. And then you can tell, I love, it's like sitting across the table from him and how lucky we would be. So here in 66, he talks about George running the mill all night. He ground 200 bushels of wheat since breakfast yesterday. Cloudy and snowy, Mr. Dobbins and Mr. Cohn came down and passed the evening. Mrs. FBO brewed a very nice eggnog. 1867, intend on running the mill tonight. Mill busy all day. Roast chicken, mince pies, tarts, and donuts. Donuts. Yeah, I agree. Donuts show up a lot in these stories. What did I do with my clicker? That's right. So what do you call it when they don't have a hole in the middle? A donut? Still donut? Okay. All right then. Oh, now, Granville Stewart. And this is where I got a peek at Dave's research process. Because God bless Dave, of course, he was giving me, or giving the reader, his sources. Well, as it turns out, in 1899, the Anaconda Standard published numerous reminiscences and interviews from founding fathers. Granville Stewart and his brother and several other young single men wind up spending the winter in Melrose in 1857. And first he starts talking about the fact that they hit Melrose, it's late fall, early winter, they're exhausted, and they have purchased horses from Mr. Grant. Cows from Mr. Grant. They're so tired that they just let the cows go, not stopping to think that perhaps it's going to be a hard winter. Luckily for the Stewart boys, it was a very warm winter. And we know that because then on Christmas Day, he gets up early and shoots a mountain sheep, which he claims was a young one. And I love this humor. I got a young one, and before I reached camp, I thought it was full grown, for it was very heavy when I got there. Their menu that day, roast mountain mutton, black coffee, and sourdough bread. And he continues by saying, that winter we had no vegetables. Get tired of sourdough bread and meat at some point. But maybe as long as you have your coffee. All right. Another one from the Anaconda Standard was Wilbur Fisk Sanders. His reminiscences were fascinating. He's talking about Christmas 1863. And isn't that turkey expensive? That's what we pay today. But he talks about just the week before Christmas, he had officiated in the trial of George Ives. Is it George? Mr. Ives, who is tried by a minor's court and hung. But he talks about the men he's sharing Christmas with. And it's fascinating because they have all gone through what he admits was a very traumatic experience with the trial and the hanging of George Ives, but they feel that they had no other choice. So when he's talking about this, it seems very introspective to me. But he names the men that he's with, and many of them he had never met before until, sadly, hanging George Ives. But they're all single men, or men whose wives have not come to the territory yet. Actually, it's not even Montana yet. And so they're meeting in hotels. And the first thing he talks about is turkeys coming from Salt Lake Valley and how expensive they are. $25 to $40 in 1863. But there again, nog, concocted of fresh eggs and other spirits and spices. And he says this, the adjective fresh is a relative term. And then he discusses the fact that some people in town have eggs from the States. Now, so just to get you into the mindset, 1863, almost 20 years before we get railway into Montana. However, freight is coming down through the spring and summer from Fort Benton, where there are steamboats bringing supplies, or they're coming up from the Salt Lake area, freight wagon. I don't know how long it took a freight wagon to get from Salt Lake to Virginia City. My guess is longer than just a couple days. Eggs. As he says, that adjective fresh is a relative term. Exactly. Ew is right. I couldn't have said it better myself.
But didn't they keep their eggs in glycerin?
They did. But then the question would be, is there glycerin available in Virginia City in 1863?
Would be after the eggs rot.
And so, maybe. That's a good question. And the story of eggs is worth a book. And quite honestly, that story of eggs is in the works. Mary Murphy out of Montana State University is writing about that.
I knew eggs could be so interesting.
Oh, okay, I have to stop. Sidebar. So the railroads come. By the end of the 1880s, early 1890s, we've got railroads going everywhere. You're not going to believe this, but during the winter, guess where the bulk of eggs came from that were eaten in Montana? The Orient.
What?
Chickens were laying them in the Orient. They were put on a steamboat. They hit Seattle or San Francisco, and then they were put on trains for the West.
Wow.
That's a long time. Wouldn't they be moldy by then?
They wouldn't be fresh.
They would be fresh, but they would be. We're weirder about our eggs than anybody else. Everybody else just sells them on the counter. No, but they don't refrigerate them.
That's true.
They last a pretty long time.
6 weeks?
6 weeks on the counter and another 6 weeks in the refrigerator.
Oh, that's good for the eggs in my fridge. That's good. But again, he talks about the foods and he talks about the men he's with.
And the nog.
The nog. Well, I guess I am putting the nog right there with the food. All right. Railroad camp. This was great. 1882. And I have to read this because this is fascinating. I keep putting things down. That's right. Again, single men doing the best they can. All right. So we are talking we're talking about the Northern Pacific Railroad entered Montana Territory in 1881. The Christmas holiday in one of these construction camps found the men thousands of miles from their homes. And this is a narrative from one of those men who in 1903 had decided to stay. I remember that Christmas of 1882 very well. I don't know that I ever spent a more pleasant Christmas than that one. There was a big crowd of young Swedes in the grading camp located 2 miles west of Glendive, and we decided to have a celebration on the same order that we would have had in the old country. 3 of us lived in a cave. that winter. There was Sam Samuelson, Andrew Anderson, and myself in the party. Early in the winter, we had dug a cave in the high bank. We had first cut a doorway and then cut out a room about 10 feet square. Then we dug out a fireplace, and with the aid of a large number of powder cans, which strewed the right-of-way, we built a chimney and had as comfortable a home as we could imagine. Ingenious. Now, Christmas Eve in Sweden is the greatest time of all the year, and we Swedes resolved to celebrate in the old-time style. Going to Glendive, we bought 5 gallons of cognac, and with that we brewed a punch that was simply nectar to the Swedes. Simply nectar. The punch was served Christmas Eve in our little cave. The room was so small that the boys, after taking a drink or two, had to leave in order to give the fellows outside a chance. But by coming in relays that way, the entire camp was served with punch. We had a very merry time of it that Christmas. We sang the songs of the old country and told stories of other days when we had celebrated the festival in the old country. As I said, I have never spent a more pleasant Christmas. Oh my gosh. And that sense of sharing. We're going to bring joy, not just in the joy of the liquor, but the tradition. Just all the men coming together. I think that's lovely.
What do you think they could have had that one with it to make it a punch?
I looked and looked. We have a cookbook from 1881, and there is no punch in it. However, everything that I read, there was some sort of fruit. Fruit seems to make it punch. I've got a handout with lots of old recipes. I tried to line up recipes from the era of the cookbooks from some of the stories. I did find a great old eggnog recipe. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a bit. From Helena. So when I read this, I thought we're going kind of from the lowbrow to the highbrow. So 20 years after Sanders talks about that Christmas in Virginia City, look at what's available. We've got candy, walnuts, tree candles, dolls and toys, fruits, taffies. But Christmas dinner at the Hotel Helena, which in the Polk City directories claim to be the best facility in Helena, as do 3 other hotels. This is what they serve for Christmas dinner, and this is astounding. Are you ready? Little neck clams, green sea turtle consomme, salted almonds, plain shad, potatoes, olive celery lettuce, frog saddles. I don't know. Exactly. I think it had to have been frog legs. Cream fritters, prime rib, young turkey, champagne punch, roast partridge, chicken, and boned turkey truffles. I think that must have been croquettes. Do you know what croquette is? You take, it's a very traditional way of using meat, is you take pieces of meat and then you put it in a thick sauce. And then you roll it in breadcrumbs and fry it. And of course, you fry anything and it's good. Chicken, mashed potatoes, boiled potatoes, sweet baked potatoes, asparagus on toast, French peas, cauliflower, Christmas pudding, mince pie, lemon meringue pie, strawberry Bavarian cream, maraschino jelly, assorted cake, New York ice cream, confectionery, nuts, figs, raisins, fruit, crackers, American cheese, and finally coffee. Big difference. Big difference. All right. So from that, plenty. You can't talk Montana traditions without talking homesteaders. Iowa Bench, and I had to look this up, is not far from Denton. Everybody know where Denton is? Denton is, just a minute. Denton is east of Lewistown. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. And this part of Montana was heavily, heavily homesteaded. But we have a young couple by the name of Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Gladson. And on the 1st of December in 1908, they decided, by golly, they were going to have Christmas. And they rode to all the neighbors and invited them for Christmas dinner, invited them to bring whatever they could, and encouraged people to make TOYs. TOYS, for surprises. And then she describes the fact they are living in a homesteader's cabin that is actually big. It's 14 by 22 feet. But she and Charlie clean it out of all the superfluous furniture so that they can accommodate their neighbors. In the meantime, she talks about her and Charlie using every scrap of wood they can find to make dolls' beds, doll cupboards, little miniature sleighs for the boys, on and on and on. Then she and Charlie drove to Stanford to get the candy nuts, oranges, and apples. Also a few little candies for the tree, which was a journey of 50 miles with team and buggy at 10 below zero. That's wanting to have Christmas with the community. Then people started gathering. They sang songs. Their little house was bursting at the seams. And after the gifts were handed out from underneath the first Christmas tree ever seen in this area, well, one could question that. Yeah, no wonder. She doesn't say where the Christmas tree comes from. Yeah. That's true. A shrub.
Sagebrush.
But lunch was served of ham sandwiches, donuts, and popcorn balls and coffee for everyone present. And then, this is the first time I see popcorn balls. And I remember my grandma. Oh, she used to make popcorn balls starting at Halloween and continuing through the holidays. Oh my gosh, she made great caramel. All right, so again, that food and the community, it's just wonderful. Thinking of harder times. 1932, Harlow, or Harlowton, I call it Harlow. And someday, after I win the lottery, when you drive through Harlow coming from this direction, and if you take that first right once you get into town, and it takes you around on the edge of that bluff, have you ever done that? You cannot drive through Harlow without doing that circuit. And you come out real close to this old hotel. But the houses on that bluff have the most beautiful view of the crazy mountains. It's breathtaking. And I fantasize every time of just doing needlepoint with a hot cup of tea and it being 10 below, sitting in one of those houses and just watching the weather come and go over the crazies. But that's my favorite part of Harlowton. It's a gorgeous little town. But the people of Harlowton in 1932 got together. And there is a newspaper article. It's on the first page of both the Harlow News as well as the Lewistown News. And it talks about, it's just this list of people who have donated. People have donated steers. People have donated just everything imaginable. And then they had a fundraiser at the little theater, and to get in, and this is something we do today, you need a donation of canned goods or, and I love this, Christmas delectables. Christmas delectables. So and then I had to see what the heck was a Christmas delectable in 1932, and darned if the Lewistown paper didn't have a section for the thrifty housewife. And we have Vermont fudge, coconut icebox cookies that have coconut, orange, lemon extract, and almond extract, and vanilla in it. So, very complex level of flavors. But it just goes on and on. They also are selling at the local store all the nuts you can imagine with French creams, English toffee, jelly beans, red or green, gumdrops, and fancy box chocolates, candied fruits. It just goes on and on. They talk about then a big celebration and how many families And they list 90 families. They don't list the families, but the article says 90 families received boxes filled with food and supplies from the funds raised, as well as the supplies at the matinee and other donations. And are you ready for this? I love this. Despite the Depression, there wasn't a family in Wheatland County without an ample supply for Christmas. Oh, I love that. Then I went to one of my favorite reminiscences written by a gentleman by the name of Jim Sargent. And he grew up north of Big Timber. And he talks about growing up in the Depression. And there were, this may not be a surprise for anybody who knows Montana history, a lot of Norwegians in that area. And he talks about, you ready? At these gatherings, and there were about half a dozen families. They would take turns going to the sergeants, who his dad was not Norwegian, so he was the odd man out, and could never drink coffee the right way to please the rest of the Norwegians. But they would go to all the other, and the favorite food, lefse. But you talk about the dozens and dozens of kids that would come together, and there never being enough lefse until he became an adult, and a couple of the women got together and taught him how to make lefse. And then he said, after that, I always had enough lefse for Christmas. He is a hoot. There we go. This, I thought, was particularly interesting. I was a little young in 67. Well, I was younger in 67. But for those of you who have been around Montana for a while, that was a really excruciating winter for the folks who belonged to the miners' unions. And they were on strike against the Anaconda Copper Company, had been on strike for a long time, I'm afraid. And the fact that they were on strike had economical ramifications all over the state. But shortly before Christmas, there were truckloads and train cars load of supplies shipped to Butte from Yellowstone County. The Big Timber is Sweetgrass. Say again. Stillwater. Where's Big Timber, though? That's, yeah, Sweetgrass. Okay, thank you. And Park County. And it's, I think what happened is the train just stopped in all those places after it left Billings. 11 tons of food were
donated by other unions or something?
Well, it could be, but this particular source just talks about the communities in Montana. And I'm sure they were getting support from other places. But 11 tons hit that area, and plus toys and clothes. So, oh yeah, good, thank you. And that made me smile. But then when I think of the 60s, guess what foods I think of? What foods do you think of in the 60s? McDonald's were just, yeah. Not Butte. See, Billings had a McDonald's in the 60s. I think Jell-O.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah,
Lots of Jell-O. So probably 1 ton of that was Jell-O. And canned pineapple. All right. So now I came to the point where I have a couple of favorite Christmas stories. And so I had to leave Dave behind. And because it is my presentation, I just kind of skewing it, and we will talk about food, but in a different way. But one of my favorite Christmas stories, as most of you may know, Montana, since the 1950s, has donated 3 Christmas trees to the nation's capital. They're under different Christmas tree programs, but the first 2 came from the Kootenai National Forest. One was in 58 and went to President Eisenhower's White House. Then the second tree was the Capitol Christmas tree, and that is it. That is a picture of the Capitol Christmas tree, and there in the upper right. And then the third one came from, I want to say, the Bitterroot. That was within the last 10 years. I want to say about 8 years ago. But the one in 1989, this is just great. And talk about community. So early in the winter, I'm going to say more late fall. In October, the Western News, the newspaper coming out of Libby, is saying, oh boy, we've been given the honor of supplying the nation's Christmas tree, and now we want to know who do the people of Lincoln County want to cut it down. And it came real close between a gentleman by the name of Mr. Bill Chrismore, who was one of our state representatives at the time, and an old logger by the name of Red Post or Red Stout. I'd have to look it up. We're going to call him Red. He ran the patrol for the company for ages and ages. So a grader, as well as a sawyer. But Mr. Chrismore won, and there was a plan A and a plan B. And according to those who were involved in this, the people of Libby who were involved in this process preferred the tree that was plan B. But the upstarts, and this wasn't in the paper, of course, but that's what was rumored around town, the upstarts from an architect from Washington, D.C. preferred this other tree. So Mr. Chrismore and a good share of the people from town and people who were protesting the cutting of the tree all gather. Every facet of Lincoln County's community is there. And Mr. Chrismore cuts the tree. Of course, there's all sorts of what they call guidelines that have already been put on the tree so it falls where it's supposed to. But one of the guidelines winds up with too much slack, and the tree winds up falling across the truck, and if it pretty much is cold, it falls apart. So I do not believe in any of the conspiracy theories which have been proposed. I do believe it's logging. Things happen. So they wound up all going to Plan B, and here's the second tree that has fallen on the truck where it's supposed to have, or close to where it needed to be, and it's being loaded on the truck. And then for Libby and foods, I just happen to have a couple wonderful, wonderful sources. Uh-oh, am I going to be able to find them? There was a beautiful lodge outside of Libby. I'm sorry, I'm turning my back to the crowd. Here they are. Got two great cookbooks from close to that era that came out of Libby. And what I think of, when I think of 1980s cooking, I think of the beginning of prepared food. Now we've been building up the tradition of using canned soups. Jell-O is still there, but there's lots more. Velveeta, oh my gosh, lots of Velveeta.
Melted Velveeta over head of cabbage.
Cauliflower, yes. That was gourmet. Yeah. Also, when I think of the 1980s and the 70s, I think of hors d'oeuvres. You start seeing recipes for hors d'oeuvres. Instead of having different courses, we serve canapes or hors d'oeuvres. And now I don't know about you, but they've sometimes taken over the meal. You get that and some good wine, you don't need anything else. So that is one of my favorite Christmas stories. What a hoot that was. And then, my last story, 1992, Billings, Montana. And in the late 80s and early 90s, the Northwest became a gathering place for very I'm trying to think of a delicate way to put this, for neo-Nazis. There's just no other way of saying it. For supremacists. That's the word I'm using for. And there we're going into the holidays there were some attacks on homes of Jewish folks. And the town of Billings, a good share of the town of Billings, rallied, especially after the Billings Gazette published a full-page color ad, and this is what it looked like, with a menorah. Because the police chief is quoted as saying that discrimination is not a police problem, it is a community problem. And the people of Billings rally around their friends and neighbors, and by the thousands, they were putting this in their window. And I think that is, talk about community. This is it to me. All right. And for those of you who are wondering where this is going with food, one of my favorite cookbooks is the Butte Heritage Cookbook. If you don't have it, get online and find it, because Butte is so proud of their heritage, and they have a section on Jewish foods. And so I photocopied that for you. So I had to make a food connection in there somewhere. All right. So another Charlie Russell. So, oh shoot, I don't know. A late night, a late night alone, I guess. I think it's Santa asking for directions or giving this guy a bag of coal. But there is just a sampling of Christmas stories, wonderful Montana Christmas stories, with just a hint, more than a hint, but conveying the importance, whether you're having a Thanksgiving ceremony where you are featuring pemmican and being thankful for the answer to some prayers, or whether you are hanging a paper menorah in your window to support your neighbors or to say, no, we're not going to put up with this, not in my town. Montana has been a pretty great place to winter. It takes a lot of work, often, but between community and food, it would appear that Montanans have gotten through it. Thank you again for coming out. Oh my gosh. So, you do not have to take one of these, but let me